Good morning, everybody. The webinar will get started in just a minute. We'll just wait until a few more participants are able to get in to join us. Thank you for setting time aside in your schedule this morning to spend an hour with us on this important topic. To those of you just joining, we'll get underway in just a minute. It looks like we've had a slowdown in people joining the event, and so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Ruth Schmidt. I am the Executive Director of Wisconsin Early Childhood Association, and here also today representing Raising Wisconsin. I want to thank you all for attending the second in our series of webinars on business and economic voices and the intersection of childcare with workforce issues and economic issues in the state of Wisconsin. This is a critical issue for Raising Wisconsin, and we have an incredible panel of individuals joining us today to talk about this important issue. And so before I introduce the keynote speaker of this morning's webinar, I want to also share with you that Chris Hardy from Seven Rivers Alliance is going to be moderating a panel discussion. And that panel discussion will include James Otterstein with Rock County Development Agency, Amanda Payne with the Waukesha County Business Alliance, and Kaylin Winiger with the Eau Claire Area Chamber of Commerce. It's going to be a packed amount of time talking as a panel. So please keep track of your questions. We will have a Q&A box open for you to put questions in as we proceed through, and we'll have time at the end of the webinar to pause and respond to some questions. Okay. So again, thank you for joining us. Today's webinar is called The Growing Intersection of Childcare, Business, and Workforce Productivity. And I am super happy to introduce Missy Hughes. Missy Hughes is the Secretary and CEO of Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation, which is Wisconsin's lead economic development organization. Missy has been a champion of early childhood as an economic development issue and opportunity as WECA and Raising Wisconsin's coalition building efforts have grown over the past 3 years. Before joining WEDC in October of 2019, she was General Counsel and Chief Mission Officer at Organic Valley. She served on the boards of the Environmental Working Group and the Organic Trade Association, where she was a 3-term board president. The U.S. Secretary of Agriculture appointed Missy to the USDA Advisory Committee on Agriculture and Biotechnology in the 21st century. Missy received her Bachelor of Arts degree in Political Science from Georgetown University and Juris Doctorate degree from the University of Wyoming College of Law. I just want to personally say I have often been in conversations with Missy and really, really appreciate her passion for this issue. So without saying more, I want to introduce Missy Hughes.
Thank you, Ruth, and good morning. I think it's still morning. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. Ruth, I want to thank you for keeping this conversation going, with so much noise and so much happening in the universe. It's really critical that we keep an eye and a focus on this issue. So thank you for hosting this webinar. And thank you for having me today. It's funny to hear my bio and to think about my background in organic food and all of those things. But, I think for this conversation, the important things to remember are that I'm a mother of 3 and I am the youngest of 7 children. My mother was a doctor, a groundbreaking doctor. She was one of the first women to graduate from Columbia Medical School and went on to have a thriving practice, but also 7 children. And so the childcare issue is, incredibly important to me as a working mom and the daughter of a working mom. And as we went through the last few years and seeing the challenges that we had around childcare, I knew that my mother would be essentially rolling in her grave at the thought that, we are still struggling with this issue. And along those lines, I had an economic developer the other day say to me, who would have thought that we would be talking about childcare and economic development? And I had to take a breath to really think about what that person was saying. He's like, yeah, who would have thought? But if we recognize that women have been an incredible engine for the economy over the course of the last, let's say, 50 years, then we should have known that childcare would be incredibly important, that working families are such an engine for our economy. We would have known that childcare is an incredibly important issue and something we should be tackling. So I'm endeavoring not to be upset that we're still talking about whether or not childcare is important to the economy and how we're moving on to solutions. But we're bringing everybody along, and in particular today, I think we're talking about the businesses in Wisconsin and helping to bring them along as we have this conversation about the importance of childcare. And I thought I would just share some numbers around how much this is impacting our economy. So the Bipartisan Policy Center has estimated that there's about 117 Wisconsin children who don't have adequate access to childcare. And Ruth, I'm sure you have excellent numbers on this, but they estimated that the cost of to the economy for each of those children is about $36,000 to $54,000. So what that translates into is that Wisconsin's economy is losing out on somewhere between $4.2 to $6.4 billion over 10 years because of the weakness in our childcare system. And we see that in terms of lost wages for families. We see that in terms of lost tax revenue, lost productivity, and then of course the impact that has on business and the ability for business to grow and innovate when they don't have access to that incredible amount of revenue into the economy. I think that the challenge around the childcare model is that it's this classic example of a market failure. We try so much to allow capitalism to work when it needs to work. That's the basis of our country. But when you see an instance where the private childcare businesses are trying to provide a service, but because of the costs associated with those services, they aren't able to provide them at an affordable rate for those working families. And then those working families are forced to make an economic decision to stay home because they don't have access to affordable, safe, and childcare. That has ripple effects through the rest of the economy. So they're staying home, they're not contributing to the economy, their income is probably less, and then the businesses don't have access to that workforce. And when we're in such a workforce crunch, we see how that ripple effect really starts to then compound upon itself. So over the course of the last few years, while I've been in this role, I've had a number of different conversations with businesses, and many of them don't really, they're busy running their businesses, right? No fault of their own. They don't really engage with understanding the difficulties of this situation. They only have a small portion of their employees who are impacted by this at any given moment. And they, just are busy doing what they're doing. And they think, well, it must be just an inability to run the business. But really what this is something that we need to be thinking about in a whole public-private model. And, while we have some businesses that have been really innovative and are opening their own childcare, we've worked with Aaron's and Company, who is opening a childcare center right in Brillion, really innovative, working really hard to meet the needs of their manufacturers and other manufacturing workers in the region. Quick Trip has opened up a childcare center in La Crosse, which is really exciting for their 3,000 plus employees in that area. But again, these businesses that are doing this, it's not necessarily something that can be scaled across the state, right? We can't expect every business to open up their own childcare center. And when businesses do that, it's often catered towards their employees and not towards the employees of, a whole region or something like that. So we need to keep understanding how we can make the changes on a public-private basis that will really impact this struggle that we're facing. So at WEDC, we've been working over the last few years to understand where we can have an impact. And, honestly, I think one of the biggest impacts that we have is just in talking about this and talking about how incredibly impactful this is on our economy, and really, having the data behind it and being able to really articulate that. And, one of the things that I've really been working on with businesses is to understand truly what the impact is on their business in terms of costs and expenses. And the reason I'm doing that is because it's really the best way to then talk about, okay, how do we invest to save those dollars? So for example, we have data coming out of some work that we're doing in Wapaka County that if a business trains someone for 90 days and gets them onto the floor, gets them up to speed on how to operate on their factory floor, it costs about $9,000 for that business. If that employee then doesn't come to work after 70 or 90 days, they are losing those expenses. And if that relationship is to the childcare issue, then we can say directly businesses are having that impact. And so as you all are talking to businesses or working with businesses, if you can help find those data points that can really help make our case for why we need additional childcare support, I think that's really going to help us all as we move forward through this conversation. Some of the other things that we're doing at WEDC is we had the opportunity to work with the Department of Workforce Development on what we're calling the Workforce Innovation Grants. This was $128 million that the governor dedicated to trying to find solutions to these barriers that are keeping Wisconsinites from fully participating in the economy. And I think we have up 4 or 5 of these 27 grants were focused on the childcare issue. So I'll just give you a few examples of what we're thinking about when it comes to these barriers. And, as many of you know, one of the biggest barriers for having really a vibrant childcare ecosystem around the state is the burden on the childcare employees to be able to continue their careers. Access to housing, access to childcare, access to education are all really difficult for the childcare employees themselves. And so in Door County and in Milwaukee, we've got 2 projects that are really focused on childcare employee housing. So how do we make sure that the individuals who are helping to take care of our Wisconsin children have access to safe and stable housing? And in Door County, we're able to work with the Door County Medical Center, who is supporting the Sturgeon Bay's only licensed group childcare there, and they're helping with developing housing for the workers. If we can all think about Door County, the housing there is very, very tight, and is faced with tourism pressures and Airbnb pressures and all of these pressures. And so helping to make sure that there's adequate housing in a rural community like Sturgeon Bay is really critical. And then you go to Milwaukee, and we're working with LISC there to understand how can we help childcare workers in Milwaukee be able to access housing and understand that there's a path for them to be a homeowner. And that's a really exciting program. Milwaukee has an incredible shortage of housing. And so to have housing being built with a focus on transferring that housing to childcare workers is really exciting. We also have 2 childcare workforce innovation grants that are focused on training. So in at the Madison Area Tech College, we are focused on helping them to train not only workers, but potentially someone who wants to own their own childcare center. And we're excited about that program for the opportunity to really increase the number of childcare workers in the Madison area and then up through that whole corridor. And then we're also focused on training in Milwaukee with the Community Relations and Social Development Corporation. They're offering training on site with helping with paying for the licensing and the technical work that needs to be done. But I had a chance to visit there and talk with some of the educators who've gotten a chance to go through that training program, and it's life-changing for them, but it's also really life-changing for the children. I had a conversation with a man who's this big, lovely 6'2" man who had been, I think, a 7th and 8th grade teacher, and now is a provider for a 1-year-old classroom. And you can just imagine these little kids looking up at this giant man and having an opportunity to have a relationship with him. And it's just really incredible. But this is all the work that we're thinking about. How can we be really innovative to help foster the childcare system in Wisconsin, work in conjunction with you? And it's all just because it's incredibly important when it comes to supporting the Wisconsin economy. And, you know, I really try to approach this as not a mom, as not a daughter, even though I started with that, but really with the idea that my role is to develop the Wisconsin economy. And my role is to make sure we're all thinking about how do we have everyone in Wisconsin have the opportunity to prosper. And that opportunity comes when you have adequate housing, when you have good transportation, good education, but when you know that your children are safe and you can afford to put them someplace, and it's an ongoing, stable opportunity. So it's incredibly important that we continue this conversation and that we keep doing this work. I'm really excited to hear from today's panel about what they are hearing from businesses and how we might continue to gain momentum on this conversation. So Ruth, thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to turn it over to the panel and hear what the conversation is.
All right, wonderful. Missy, thank you so much for your continued leadership at WEDC, and also for bringing this awareness to this important topic, that childcare is connected to our workforce. And it's just vitally important that we continue with that conversation. Good afternoon, or good morning, it still is morning. I'm Chris Hardy, the CEO of the Seven Rivers Alliance. We're a La Crosse-based regional economic development organization, and I've been here at Seven Rivers Alliance since 2017. Formerly executive director of the Black River Area Chamber of Commerce, and I've spent more than 30 years in the newspaper industry as a reporter, editor, and publisher. Before I introduce our wonderful panel, I became involved in childcare back in 2017 when the Seven Rivers Alliance launched a very comprehensive workforce development plan. We took a deep dive into the issues that were leading to our worker shortage, and we identified 3 main challenges across our region, and that is housing, transportation, and childcare. Since that time, Seven Rivers Alliance has been involved in a number of state and regional efforts with the Jackson County Child Care Network and La Crosse County initiatives, and many other efforts to try to bring this challenge of childcare to not only our region, but to the state. So joining me today in this important conversation are James Otterstein. James is from the Rock County Development Alliance. He's an economic development manager for Rock County and provides economic development consultant services to public and private sector clients. He has received an array of recognition and awards for economic development achievements and serves on several local, regional, and state leadership and board member positions. We also have Amanda Payne with the Waukesha County Business Alliance. Amanda is Senior Vice President of Public Policy and leads the organization's advocacy work by engaging local business leaders in the public policy process and ensuring the business voice is heard. She manages the Manufacturing Alliance of Southeastern Wisconsin and several Alliance policy committees. Amanda is past Milwaukee Business Journal 40 Under 40 recipient. And we also have Kaylin Winiger from the Eau Claire Area Chamber of Commerce. Kaylin is Vice President of Workforce Initiatives and currently leads the Chamber's Employer Workforce Initiatives, which help solve workforce challenges for small, medium, and large business owners. She's passionate about service to the community and continues to look for opportunities to make a positive impact. So let's start, panelists, let's start today with this question. We know that the availability of childcare is a workforce issue. All of you have direct connections with businesses. What have you been hearing from them on this topic? And Amanda, we'll start with you.
Sounds good. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, that's a good question. I would say, for us in Waukesha County, workforce is the biggest challenge for our employers, without a doubt. And we have heard that for years, and that continues to be the case, probably even more so coming out of COVID. Childcare for us is a newer conversation, maybe a little bit than what you referenced in your area. We have identified these surrounding workforce issues, housing, transportation, childcare, and really in the last few years worked to both understand those issues better and educate our business community on those issues. So, for us, sometimes the challenge is our employers understand that workforce is the biggest thing impacting their business. They know they don't have enough employees, or there's high employee turnover, or both. We have really worked to get to the second layer of that. So why aren't there as many employees, or what are the barriers that are preventing people from either showing up for work regularly, showing up for the interview in the first place? And so I would say we're probably, not as far along as what you referenced in your area in terms of really understanding and drilling down into that childcare issue. But certainly we're talking a lot more about it than we have, in the last 10 years that I've been here, and really working to both understand and educate businesses on it and help them to connect those pieces. So it has been a high priority for us, and certainly a topic of conversation that has continued to increase in the last few years.
All right. Kaylin, what have you heard from your businesses in the Chippewa Valley area?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think the biggest thing that we've taken away from our businesses is that the war for talent is over. Talent has won, which means we're talking about childcare and those invisible and visible barriers that exist for employees in our area. And so early in 2020, when the pandemic hit, we put together a COVID economic recovery task force, and childcare was one of the top issues, both from the provider side and the parent side, and our employers. And so we've been able to fortunately start tackling this issue pretty early on. And at the end of 2021, we did put together a Chippewa Valley economic childcare task force. And so we have a seat at the table as a chamber to voice those concerns of business and industry when it comes to the lack of availability and the cost of childcare. The other perspective that we're really able to bring is because our United Way, who's leading this effort, represents both Eau Claire and Chippewa counties. We have some very unique challenges to our rural community, which is like transportation and the fact that care is not near home and oftentimes not near work. And so those additional travel times. There's also a longer workforce search period for the talent that's needed at the providers and their care. And then there's a little bit of a lack of trust too, because of those workforce shortages. We've been having some closures, particularly in infant rooms in our area, which is exacerbating the problem. So as I stated, we were able to really kind of get people at the table to start talking about what these issues are. And I think we'll get into some solutions later and what that's kind of brought to our region.
All right. Thanks, Kaylin. James, what have businesses in Brock County been telling you about childcare?
Yeah, certainly not dissimilar to what the other two panelists have commented on, but our conversation and our involvement in this particular topic, we got a head start on it. Quite honestly, it started back in year 2000, a little bit prior to that, where we had a formal consortium of a number of employers that came together. And unfortunately, when the Great Recession hit, the need and the opportunity for that consortium went by the wayside. So here we are, fast forward, another decade later, and lo and behold, this issue hasn't went away. So certainly the same sort of issues that have been talked about, you're going to find common themes, right? Transportation, housing, childcare, geographic considerations, capacity issues in terms of not necessarily first shift, but more importantly, second and third shifts. Those after hours and weekend care opportunities certainly continue to plague not only existing providers, but certainly parents and employees alike. And quite honestly, depending on what employer you're talking to on which day, and depending on who you're talking to in that particular organization, you may get a different answer. So there is a bit of a disconnect in terms of the dialogue. I would argue a bit of a disconnect in terms of where the true needs might be. And quite honestly, given the hyper competitive environment in terms of employee recruitment retention, there isn't the opportunity for exit interviews anymore. People are gone, right? And they've already moved on. And given the amount of remote working and everything else that is happening today, it's a really different dynamic. So it creates a different environment for conversations to either start to move forward, or for those that need to be kind of elongated in terms of, no, this isn't just a one-time we're done. We need to continue to have this dialogue. So I would argue that, in our marketplace, certainly the public and private sector are continually trying to figure out what is the right avenue to advance the conversation, and more importantly, what is the right mixture of proposed solutions. And I don't think anybody has a clean and definitive answer on that yet.
All right, thanks, James. One thing that we know about childcare is that while there are universal challenges regarding availability and staffing, there are also some unique community challenges. So, James, I'm going to come right back to you. Gathering data on understanding your community's unique childcare needs is critical. What has been done in Rock County in regards to looking at the data?
Right. So I'm going to rewind the clock again. So back in 2000, we started a Rock County Child Care Consortium, and there were 4 main employers that were at the table. We had the County of Rock, at the time, General Motors, one of their largest sequencers, Lear Seating, and then another company in town, Lab Safety Supply, who is now known as Granger. But in any event, combined, those employers represented about 8,400 employees. And there was no doubt that top of mind was after-hour care, drop-in emergency care. How do you fill for vacations and other emergencies that come up in the provider network? So at the time, they had basically developed an agreement, provided funding, and there was a facility that was created for those employees known as Just in Time for Kids. We can get into the details here later, but unfortunately, due to a variety of circumstances, there wasn't sustainability associated with that. So fast forward to where we're at now in terms of the same sort of needs, the same sort of dialogue, and more importantly, the same sort of outreach has taken place. So case in point, last calendar year between April and May, there was surveys that were done countywide, very specific in terms of childcare, asking employers specifically where their needs, pain points were at, asking them to comment on what type of impact this has had on both annual absenteeism rates as well as vacancy rates, those types of things. And in addition to that, we also surveyed the providers themselves, the childcare providers, again, talking about capacities, needs, opportunities, what are the biggest challenges out there. And it was pretty interesting, the data and feedback that we got back. No doubt, staffing, issue number one across the board, right? If you're talking to employers, they roughly estimated about 20% of both their absentee and vacancy rates on an annualized basis are due 100% or predominantly due to childcare related issues. And so in terms of the number of employers that are offering support on that front, roughly 75% are offering the traditional, dependent care savings accounts, right? Where that's an employee benefit, but very few are offering on-site direct care. And quite honestly, back in 2000, there were only a handful of companies that were offering direct on-site child care support at their facilities. Now, there's a lot more conversation right now because there's a hypersensitivity to employee recruitment retention, and a number of companies are trying to figure out how they can do it either in a general geographic area or how they can pool resources to figure out to buy available slots that are out there. Conversely, you've got the same challenges on the provider side, right? A number of folks are operating at or below pre-pandemic levels. And the reason being is because they can't find or keep staffing. And if they were to grow and to resume either pre-pandemic levels or absorb new capacity issues, even if they have the licensure, the licensing ability to go up to that particular level, they don't have the appropriate staff to make that happen. So it really is a double-edged sword, as you would say, in terms of the challenges that are out there. And these are really good data points that we continue to utilize and have conversations about to come up with, multiple proposed solutions. How do we attack this thing on a countywide basis versus just a singular zip code approach?
All right, thanks, James. Kaylin, your chamber serves more of a rural area. You mentioned in your opening statement a little bit about transportation. But what are some other challenges does that bring to your business community, especially when it revolves around childcare?
Yeah, one of the things that we wanted to do with the task force very early on was to determine what our availability is in current providers and then what the need is. So right now we have availability or open slots of almost 130 slots in our area. And that's just in our rural communities, not the cities of Eau Claire and Chippewa Falls that we represent here. Unfortunately, our gap is still quite high, so we need to fill over 700 slots of kids who just need to find space, which is that birth to 5-year-old range. So we have a huge gap. One of the key indicators was trying to keep our current providers open in those areas, so we're not exacerbating the problem. The other is attracting new family care options. So really tackling if we've got some family members in the area who want to take care of 1 or 2 kids. So we're increasing that pipeline and childcare options. And then the lack of wraparound care options, which I know James hit on here, is incredibly problematic because of so many shift differentials that we have. Manufacturing is a huge industry for us in this area. And so we're trying to tackle that as well here. The one last specific thing that I'll mention is the lack of specialists for underserved populations is kind of a unique challenge for our area for those who maybe have disabilities or at-home crisis situations. And so we're finding it really hard to find trained and skilled individuals who are willing to stay and serve in rural communities that have that representation needed for those care centers. So those are some of the things that we're trying to tackle unique to the rural communities here.
All right, thanks, Kaylin. Amanda, you serve more of an urban area with important workforce and business connections to the greater Milwaukee metro area. How has that impacted childcare in your area?
Yeah, I would say our statistics for Waukesha County are similar to James and Kaylin. So we know that we lost about 70 slots during the pandemic for early child care just in Waukesha County, and similar to elsewhere around the state. That's not really a true representation because there are so many that are slots available on paper, but the rooms are not staffed, so they're not open, especially in that infant space. It's hard to really figure out what the actual true numbers are just in terms of what's on paper versus what's actually available in any given day if you're calling to try to find childcare. I think for Waukesha County, we've got similar numbers to what the rest of the state does. So the childcare providers here in the county, roughly 60 to 70% of them are actively trying to fill open spots, open full-time positions. So they're losing $10,000 a month on average here in Waukesha County with not being able to really truly be fully open. So in terms of Waukesha County, I think similar. One of the things that's a little bit unique for us is that we are a suburban county to Milwaukee County. And so when thinking about childcare and, what a countywide approach might look like, we really need to be thinking more regionally. We have roughly 70,000 people that commute from Milwaukee County to Waukesha County every day for work. And so when we talk about the impact of childcare, it's both here in Waukesha County, but also in our neighboring Milwaukee County, because for Waukesha County, that's a huge source of employment for us. We have a number of employers that regularly hire from Milwaukee County, and just 70,000 people traveling in every day for work. So trying to really understand the problem more regionally. And Missy mentioned the workforce innovation grants. We were really excited about one that we've been very actively involved with in the last year, which is a transportation program. It works kind of like an Uber or a Lyft, but taking people from Milwaukee to jobs in Waukesha County. And that program was the recipient of a workforce innovation grant. And part of that for 2023 will be expanding to childcare centers as pickup zones. So if we have childcare centers in Milwaukee, what can we do to make that as easy as possible for people to both drop off a child in the morning and then get a ride to work? So that's one of the things that we're excited about that's on the radar for us in the coming months. The last thing I would say, just because Kaylin mentioned it, manufacturing, like the rest of Wisconsin, is huge here in Waukesha County. So no dissimilar to Kaylin and James, big challenges with second shift and shift timing and after hours care. And I think our employer community really is trying to be as flexible as they can and to catch up to what that flexibility looks like in a more traditional manufacturing space. So I just heard yesterday about a manufacturer that is offering 30 different shifts currently because they have staggered as many options as possible because people have to, they have to take what they can get when it comes to childcare. And so, even just personally, my own childcare center pre-pandemic, I think they opened at 6:30 in the morning, and those days are long gone. They're back to a 7 a.m. drop off and a 5:30 p.m. pickup. And so I think our employers are really working to do what they can to try to be flexible, but that, there's more involved there if you're a manufacturer than there is for some of the professional services businesses.
All right, thanks, Amanda. So all three of you have kind of taken on the roles in your communities of trying to have a dialogue, a conversation about childcare. How I'm sure we have folks on the call today or on the meeting today that maybe would like to start that in their own community or their own county. What is some best practices and advice in how to get that conversation going? Because this is such a large topic. Who are some of the key stakeholders or shareholders that you have noticed that are vitally important to be at the table? And Kaylin, we'll start with you.
Great, thanks. Our conversation actually started with our local United Way because this fits in with a lot of their basic needs initiatives. And so they really started bringing the right people to the table where the chamber kind of supplemented. So we've got representation from our local chambers. We have representation from our Western Dairyland and Child Care Partnership here. We have lots of representation, if you can get them, of your child care providers and the vast array of them, whether it's a large center or an in-home family care. That representation at the table has been absolutely critical. And then we've got some of the service providers in the area and the talent pipeline providers. So we've got university, we've got Chippewa Valley Technical College at the table. And then we also have a few folks that have some marketing skills up their sleeve, because one of the big issues that we noticed is that almost everyone was trying to tackle this issue with very little education and outreach going out to our community and our parents and our citizens of the region. And so that was just one specific identifying need that we had with our task force here. So that's kind of where we started. And then we also identified just trying to get representation from the various communities that we represent to make sure that all of those perspectives were at the table, to try and keep it as equitable as possible, but also try and make sure that we had a focus and a place to start and a place to find some solutions.
James, what kind of advice would you offer in terms of how do you start this dialogue in your community?
The easiest response to that is ditto. Quite honestly, those are kind of all the baselines you got to hit. And our area in particular, perhaps has had a little more experience with crises, so never waste one, right? So that platform, that opportunity, that convening appetite is probably a little bit sharper in our particular market versus others, just because we've been through these types of things before. The challenge comes down to communication relationships, as well as, navigating all the extraneous noise that might be out there. So if you can get the right stakeholders at the group and bring in the right data at the appropriate time, that certainly puts you in a position to at least have some productive conversations. And then, if folks can figure out a pathway to leverage resources instead of cannibalizing them, that also sets you up for a better success, both short and long term.
And Amanda.
Yeah, ditto to everything that's been mentioned. The only thing I guess I would add from our perspective, I think we really started more so with the employer community, just because that's our core membership and that's where our relationships tend to be strongest. In terms of the childcare provider aspect, we started with some of our large employers that do offer on-site childcare, who could both speak to the issue from the business perspective, but also from the perspective of running a childcare center. And then very good conversations with our local technical college here, both from the aspect of education, for the profession of early care and education, but also they run an on-site childcare center here at our local tech college that's open to students, employees, and to the general public. So that was a really good partner for us because they hit a bunch of different categories there. And then the one I would add is we've had some really good conversations with some of our legislators to bring them along in the education process and have them have a seat at the table with our businesses so that as our businesses are explaining what their challenges are or learning more about, the true impact of childcare, that our legislators are there to hear and be part of that conversation as well.
Chris, could I clarify something?
Of course.
I'm wearing two hats here, so I'm very similar to an Amanda in my regular day job. I'm business and industry. And so when I'm talking about all these partners we bring to the table, it's with my task force hat on. So we are a seat of that table. And the one that I missed in addition to the legislators was the licensing folks from your county and state for providers to help break down some of the barriers for starting new childcare and figuring out what some of that red tape is, have been really, really critical to any success that we've had with our task force. Thank you.
All right, absolutely. So, James, in our conversations prior to this webinar, you mentioned that there's a childcare white paper that is being worked on right now by the Wisconsin Economic Development Institute. I wonder if you could tell us a little something about the importance of that.
Right. So there is currently kind of an aggregate research project that's going on. So as you can appreciate, over the course of the last year and a half, plus or minus, a number of childcare surveys have been deployed either on a statewide, regional, or countywide basis. So what you have is a lot of information that hasn't been necessarily assembled, compiled, and sifted through in terms of, what's the data actually say? More importantly, what are some of the thoughts or ideas that are coming about? So WEDC, the Wisconsin Economic Development Institute, which is the foundation and research arm for WEDA, the Wisconsin Economic Development Association, has contracted with Baker Tilly to produce this white paper. We're hoping that this white paper will be released sometime in February. Certainly the data in there is going to be aggregated, and it'll include feedback and responses from the employer community, employees themselves, as well as childcare providers, because there's been quite a bit of work done throughout the state on gathering this information, and just a couple preliminary teasers that are out there, right? So not surprising, 83% of the respondents, particularly on the employer side, agree that access to affordable childcare and childcare in general is certainly a workforce issue. And then certainly it's impacting retention issues, which is not surprising. We've heard that here today, as well as I'm sure we're going to continue to hear it moving forward. And that back to some of Missy's points, particularly on kind of the disruptive nature, it's certainly, having impacts directly on business operations, productivity, so on and so forth. So it's very real, it's happening, and it continues to be top of mind, conversation. And more importantly, just to kind of right size the expectations, this particular white paper isn't going to come out with a singular magic solution in terms of this is a policy we need to go with. It's going to talk about a variety of opportunities that are out there. More importantly, it's designed to create a conversation platform to help keep the dialogue going in a very productive manner. And, again, it's going to emphasize and reemphasize the fact that doing nothing is not an option, but it's not going to come out and say, this is the only pathway forward and this is where everybody ought to get behind. And so I encourage everyone to keep an eye out for that. Again, the public release date is going to be in February of 23, and I'm sure there'll be a fair amount of communication, both pre-launch and during its launch and after its launch, to make sure there's a strong coalition that, can and will get behind the talking points that are in there.
Great. One of the, I think, the challenges that we have with childcare, we know that we need more capacity. We just simply, the numbers, the unfilled children on waiting lists to get in. When you have this dialogue, it is vitally important that the existing providers be at the table, and that we need to hear their challenges and how we can continue to support them. I'll throw this out for anybody to answer. What tips can you offer about how to bring them to the table and how to listen to their needs?
I can start, or unless Amanda, you want to?
You go ahead.
Okay. I'll start by saying we had to go to them and not necessarily bring them to our table, because it is a very stressful time for many of our providers, particularly in a rural area. So we did start there. I will say that now that we've been able to kind of develop and cultivate some of those relationships, they're finding it beneficial to now be at the table for those longer and more important conversations. And so the relationship building here has been a really wonderful highlight from both the professional and personal level, because I am a brand new mom. I am dealing with this childcare issue from a very personal level as well. And I tackled this with oh my gosh, these providers are the problem. And now I have a very unique seat at the table to hear about all the challenges that our providers have as well. So that has been really wonderful to have all of those folks at the table. And then I'll let Amanda go.
Yeah, I think, Galen, you guys have done much more in terms of contact with the true childcare providers themselves, so we're not as far along as you. For us, it's been helpful. We have the benefit of having some employers that offer childcare, and so they can speak to it from the provider perspective, but they are, they're people that we already know. They're employers that are members of ours, businesses that are well known, and kind of next on our list is really a better connection with the true childcare providers themselves. But I think, Chris, the question is a really good one, and Missy touched on it as well. I think there's just a lack of understanding about the industry and the model. And so, at a first glance, it can be really easy to have a misconception about it's just the providers they're not paying enough. And if they paid more, they could find more staff. And, without really understanding what it's like to be in that space and to operate a business in that specific industry, I think it can be really easy from the outside to just assume that the providers themselves could fix the problem if they would just pay more, work harder, hire better, whatever the case may be. So trying to really get a better understanding of it, I think, is really critical.
James, any thoughts on this one?
Well, I concur with what's been said, and I'll put a shameless plug in for Ruth's organization. They've been a really fantastic resource to lean on and to help understand the nuances of the providers themselves, and it's really helping to open up those communication channels with those providers as well. And their field staff, the Wesson folks that are currently out in the field, particularly in our particular county, have been extremely beneficial in some specific instances with reaching folks, directing resources their way, and so on and so forth. So we continue to keep our communication channels very open and fluid, and we'll hope that we can come to some additional, proposed solutions in our marketplace moving forward in the not too distant future.
So we've talked about how childcare is an economic development issue. I mentioned our workforce development study that talked about housing and transportation. How do you separate, or do you not separate, childcare from those economic development challenges? And is our path forward weaving those together, or do we pull childcare out as a separate entity and try to fix it on its own?
I'll go first, and I guess I'll say yes to both. For us, it's really easy to get into these really broad workforce conversations, and all of a sudden you're trying to boil the ocean and solve every problem under the sun, because it's a housing problem and then a transportation problem and also a childcare problem. And so I think it's really relevant to have those conversations so that people understand that they're all interrelated. We have found, I think, it easier to attempt to tackle them kind of piece by piece to make it manageable and feel like you're making some progress towards something in those areas. So it's not a great answer, but I'd say yes to both. Think about them holistically, but then in order not to feel overwhelmed and unable to actually make progress, try and make meaningful progress in each of those areas, kind of piece by piece, has been our approach.
Okay.
Chris,
Any,
this is Missy. Can I jump in on that?
of course.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because when we went out and asked for applications for the workforce innovation grants, we asked the communities, what's your biggest challenge and how would you solve it? And so many of the communities came back with different ideas of what their biggest challenge was, whether it was childcare or transportation or housing. And ultimately, it was the energy of the community to fix a particular problem that created a winning grant. And so if there was a group that had momentum, that was working on childcare, that had been talking about it and just needed the resources, they were positioned in a place to get that that award. So I completely agree with Amanda that, you can try and solve everything, but if you have particular momentum on an issue, I think the communities and the locals should go after that and really, take that first bite of the elephant where they're excited to take the bite.
I do not disagree with anything that said. I'll just add that what we found, because we've tackled this so recently, is that we had existing resources in our community and in our state that we just weren't navigating well. And so having all of those folks at the table allowed us to get those resources, whether it was just a phone call you could make or a grant resource out into our community for providers and employers. And that has helped our community as a whole economically just kind of soar. We're one of the regions across the state that did really well with applying for federal dollars throughout the pandemic, but also afterwards, to just make sure that we were helping our area of the state, West Central Wisconsin over here, kind of rise above and support the employees and employers in our area.
James, any thoughts on this one?
No, very good points that have been made. I'll just pile on a little bit in terms of it's similar to quicksand, right? You can find yourself drowning and struggling very, very quickly in these particular topics just because there's so many different avenues. And so our approach here locally, certainly with our experience with recovering from the Great Recession, is trying to right size our approach to everything, make sure it's doable, feasible, sustainable, so on and so forth. And so it really takes quite a bit of effort to bring everyone together and to kind of accept this is what we're going to focus on today instead of trying to solve every single issue, in 12 months, right? So it takes constant communication, constant relationship management, and quite honestly, you have to have both public and private resources, and those are relative in terms of when they're important, how much you're going to lean and utilize those, and whether you can sustain those moving forward. And clearly, as you have different personalities and politics and policy ideas that come and go, those are going to impact where, when, and how, right? So it's never an easy short-term thing, and you got to be in for the long term.
Well said. So in my work with La Crosse County had decided to dedicate some of its ARPA dollars toward childcare. And so there was a discussion about, how do we support the existing providers? So it was an initial conversation about, what if we raised wages and helped our providers to retain? And so in consultation with our local childcare resource and referral network, a Parenting Place in La Crosse, I got the numbers of the number of childcare workers in La Crosse County, and assuming that they made an average of $11 an hour, just to increase their wages to $15 an hour would have cost $5 million a year. And 15 is probably not enough. And so you take a step back and you say, wow, how do we fix this? But it made me think about taking a step back in terms of, we know that we can't fix that problem overnight, but I think that one thing that each community can do is to reach out to our childcare providers and thank them for what they do, and make sure that we appreciate what they do. So that we can kind of set that tone that people who work in childcare are really, really important. So in your conversations with providers, I'm wondering if you can, how can we lift up those in childcare? Yeah, we want to pay them more, but what other things can we do to to make sure that we value the work that they do.
Yeah, I guess I think that's a good question, Chris. I would say, trying to replicate some of what happened in a positive way during the pandemic with really talking in such a positive way about these critical professions and healthcare providers. And I think a lot happened around teachers as well during the pandemic, at least in our community. There were yard signs in the front yards of local teachers, local teacher hero. And so there was a lot that happened as a silver lining, I guess I'll say, of the pandemic in terms of how we appreciate professions that maybe we had not thought of before. And so trying to replicate some of that and build on it in terms of our childcare providers. And then, to your point, just to thank them and let them know how appreciated they are and how important they are and what an important profession that is to get into, because otherwise, there's a lack of interest for people just even wanting to get into it as a future profession. It's low paying, it's not appreciated. People, you can pick just about anything these days to be in. So it's easy to pass right over that if it's not really highlighted.
Indeed.
Amanda, go ahead, Missy.
We had just a personal story. We had a home care provider lose her home to a fire a couple weeks ago here in Viroqua. And the turnout from the community, the effort from the community to support her as she rebuilds and thinks about what her next steps has been, it's just amazing to see, on social media and events that are being thrown and things like that. But I think the point you're making that we all should think about is how do we get ahead of that? Of course, Wisconsin will show up when there's a crisis and a tragedy, but how do we show our appreciation before that?
One of the conversations that we've been having with our marketing group with the task force is how do we showcase what a job looks like as a childcare worker and the impact the lasting impact that it has. The average person who's a childcare worker has very high education, but they're making, at least in our region, $10 to $11 an hour. So we're breeding a ground where they're not going to stay in that industry, even from a very young age, because it's not a sustainable wage, it's not a sustainable life. And unlike teachers, in most cases, you're also not getting any type of benefits by working in that place. So we're trying to paint the picture of just how critical this role is and try to bring in some resources, wraparound resources, whether it's stipends or training for now, because those are the resources we have at the table to help keep those people in the profession that they want to be in and the profession that they love. Secondarily, we're trying to create a pipeline with our high school and maybe even middle schoolers for job shadowing and youth apprenticeship that might exist for early childhood education to just put this in front of students in the area. Apparently, I've been sitting too long. Apologies, my light went off.
All right,
Yeah,
Yep.
I think I'm going to jump in to wrap us up.
Of course.
Only because we're at time and I want to be respectful of time. Chris, thank you. Amanda, Kaylin, James, thank you so much. Missy, thank you so much. What has really struck me in this conversation is that pretty much all of you can speak the language of early care and education and understand the economics of it and know more about this field and this industry than we probably ever could have imagined 5 years ago. So thank you for your leadership and for all the work you're doing in your communities and across the state of Wisconsin to address what is going on in early care and education and the challenges that we are facing. So thank you all again. And in closing, I just want to let everybody know who's participating today that we will be following up this webinar with an email communication that'll go to everybody who registered. It will include links to Raising Wisconsin resources. You can go to the raisingwisconsin.org website, and there you can sign up for action alerts, for advocacy digests. You can get collateral pieces on why childcare is a broken business model, what the childcare landscape looks like in Wisconsin, access to studies on the workforce, the early childhood workforce in the state of Wisconsin, ways to engage, toolkits for engaging in your communities. We will also send you a recording of this webinar that you can go back and listen to again. I know I will be, because I was just really taken with the depth of understanding that these individuals have of this issue. And then we also want to flag for you that there is going to be a childcare symposium that is being hosted by the Wisconsin Counties Association, by Wisconsin Early Childhood Association, my organization, and Raising Wisconsin. That is going to be happening on February 15th in Wisconsin Dells. You will get information on how to register for that. There's no cost to attend that. There will be a speaker, Linda Smith, who is with the Bipartisan Policy Center, who I will point out that is the organization that Missy referenced in her comments about where economic impact data comes and where we get gap analysis data on Wisconsin. You also will get other ways to stay involved through Raising Wisconsin, including access to an employer sign-on letter that we have live now for individuals that are interested in signing on to support business as an interest in advancing a public conversation about childcare in Wisconsin and ways to develop public support for this issue. Again, I know there have been a lot of questions, comments that have come in through the chat. We really wanted, or that have come in through the Q&A. We really wanted to have people able to keep this conversation going with our panelists. So we will not go into answering all of those questions at this time, but really want to again thank everyone for participating. Keep in touch with us and look for information on upcoming events that you can participate in. Thank you.